In the lesson today, I want us to look not necessarily at mothers, although most of these ladies that we will look at are mothers. I want us to talk about women who helped build the church. As we look at churches today, the typical church usually is between 60 and 70% ladies. And there's many reasons for that, socially speaking. Many times women tend to be more spiritual. Many times women tend to be more responsible in that way. And sometimes just the way we conduct church kind of appeals more to ladies than it does men, at least in our culture, in our time, in the way in which we have it. And as you look across the work of the church, and you look across the people of the church and what's being done and how it's being done, it's amazing when we look around to see all the things that the ladies do. I say it to some of the ladies here at church so much that they get tired of hearing me. But as I watch them as they fix different things, as far as our Lord's Supper, as far as this project and that project and after school, and all the different things that go on, I always say, I don't know how we did this before y'all were here. Because it's amazing all the things that are being done. And that's true not only for today, it's true in the Bible. And as you run through the Bible, you run across several ladies, and we don't preach about them or think about them as often as we do some of the others. We preach about John and Paul and Peter, and sometimes we don't speak about the ladies as much and see the contribution and the work and the backbone of the church that the ladies are. And so let's look at some of these ladies. I think we'll look at 4 this morning and see their contribution. And from that, we can reflect and notice the contribution of many ladies even today. And of course, the first lady we're going to look at, Mitch just read the Magnificat, or the prayer which Mary prayed when she found out she was going to have Jesus, the Son of God. And as we think about Mary, we see a woman who is placed in, at first, it looks like a very difficult situation. Because Jesus was all God and all man, Mary became pregnant before she was married, when she was a virgin. And you can imagine today that might be uncomfortable, but 20 centuries ago, in that part of the world at that time, it was extremely uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, people were still bringing that up to Jesus. Even as Jesus was older, about 30 years old, they would bring up, well, your mother wasn't married when she was pregnant. And yet, as she went through that and that socially awkward situation she was in, it's amazing to see the faith that she had and the contribution which she gave to the church in the raising up of Jesus. Imagine what it would be like to have God as your child. And imagine the stress that would be there. We see, as we look through our passages and look at some of these verses, up Luke 2:52, we see that Jesus was not born fully grown up. Now, of course, we know he wasn't born fully grown up in the physical side, but he wasn't born fully grown up in the spiritual side, in the intellectual side, in the social side. Because we see in Luke 2:52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Imagine what it would be like to raise Jesus. Do you think Jesus ever got a spanking when he was 3, running into synagogue? You know? Did Jesus ever get in trouble for giggling too much in church? Did Jesus ever get in trouble for this or that? Did he ever get grounded? What would it be like to raise a child, Jesus? Imagine when he was a teenager and he thought he knew everything, because he did know everything. It'd be a very interesting thing in raising him. But what you see as you especially look there in Luke chapter 2 is Mary's reaction in raising Jesus, and how she would oftentimes reflect on these things. In Luke chapter 2 and verse 18, remember Mary has just received a report from the angel that you are about to have the Messiah, the Son of God. And so as Jesus is born, and once again in an uncomfortable situation, in the manger, outside, what's it like? Well, now the shepherds, she's just had the baby, the shepherds show up And the shepherds begin giving a report of everything that they've seen and everything that they've heard. And they speak about the angels singing to them. And they speak about being led to this place. And they speak about the Son of God is now born and now is among men. What's her reaction? In chapter 2 and verse 18, it says, she treasured these things in her heart. She held them closely in her heart. A little bit later, 12 years later, as a matter of fact, they have brought Jesus because they are a believing Jewish community. They brought Jesus to the temple. And as they've left, they've done something which many of us have done as parents, especially if you have a lot of kids. You get everybody in the car, and on the way home, you realize this car is not as loud as it usually is. We've left somebody. We've lost somebody. And so they come back and they find Jesus. And Jesus is not scared. What's he doing? He is there talking to the greatest lawyers, to the greatest scholars of his day, and they are going back and forth about what the scriptures mean. Well, what would he be talking about? Messianic prophecy? Very likely. What would he be talking about? The fulfillment of the law? Very likely. But here he is, a 12-year-old, in conversation with these great scholars, going back and forth. Mary and Joseph say, why did you do this? We were worried about you. We didn't know what was going to go on. And Jesus responds to them, I must be about my Father's business. This is where I belong. This is what I need to be doing. This is who I am. And so you read there in Luke chapter 2 and verse 51, once again, this phrase, Mary held these things in her heart. She treasured these moments. Now, somebody who writes commentaries and things such as that, look at these passages like Luke 2:51 and also Luke chapter 2 and verse 18. And they point back to Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, where Luke says that more or less what the Gospel of Luke is a research paper. He says, I went back and I found the original sources. I found the witnesses. I found the people who knew about this, and I've compiled it, great Theophilus, so that you may know a good account of the things which have happened. And so many scholars say, okay, what we see here in Luke, because much of this is probably what Mary would have said as she went over the life of Jesus. But as we look at that, I want us to focus on that, keeping things in your heart. Those memories that are there. Mary had to feel a very special way when the Son of God entered into the world and first opened up his lungs and his mouth and cried. Mary must have had special thoughts and held those things in her heart when she saw those first steps. When she saw Jesus grow, and she saw Jesus perhaps read Scripture for the very first time in a synagogue, which would happen about the age of 12. Imagine her thoughts as she watched this Messiah who would in the future redeem his people, as she watched him mature and grow as a speaker and as a Jewish man, as he began to mature. Over in the book of John, it's so interesting. We see where they're at a wedding feast and they run out of the wine. And as they run out of the wine, Mary goes up to Jesus and says, you need to take care of this. And he says, my time, it's not my time yet. And it's interesting seeing Mary helping Jesus as he begins to perform his very first miracle. And what does she say? John chapter 2, verse 5, she looks at all the servants and she points to her son and says, whatever he tells you to do, you do it. You need to listen to this man and recognize his authority, his place, and what he's going to do. Every one of us, whether it's a biological mother, whether it's not, we need a cheerleader in our corner. We need someone who sees our life and sees the value which is there. We need someone who encourages us to help us to grow and to be what God has called us to be. And as we look at Mary, we see a lady who oftentimes likely didn't understand everything that was happening, but she recognized the significance of her child. After hearing Gabriel before the birth of Jesus, now we see in John chapter 19, as you look there in verse 25 through 27, She's one of the few people willing to remain around as Jesus is crucified. Crucifixion is one of the most embarrassing ways to die. Most people think that probably all of your clothes are taken away. Most people think that, as you're up there and writhing, just how shameful it would be. Many of the apostles had run away to hide because they thought they were next. Mary was not leaving the side of her child. And so as she stood there, we see that relationship, and we see how strong that relationship was. As Mary had guided Jesus growing, now Jesus looks down and he sees John, the apostle whom Jesus loved, and he says, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." In other words, take care of my mom and be sure that she's going to be okay. Now, Matthew 27:56, we think that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was one of the ladies who had gone to the tomb in order to prepare the body of Jesus. The Sabbath day had passed, it was Sunday morning, and they had gone to prepare it. Now, that's hard to figure out with certainty. There are anywhere between 7 and 5 Marys in the New Testament, and it's hard to figure out which Mary is which Mary. But many people think Mary, the mother of Jesus, was one of the first people to see that her son had been resurrected, and one of the first people to go and tell everyone else. And in Acts chapter 1 and verse 14, before the beginning of the church, we see that she's present with the apostles as they are preparing to go to all the world. Now, that's fascinating stuff as we look at Mary and we see these things, because we see that she is someone who is willing to open up her heart. She is someone who is willing to be exposed, if you will. And you can't truly love unless you're willing to expose your heart, unless you're willing to expose your identity. And Mary many times was pierced because of the things that happened to her son, because of who her son was. But we see at the very beginning, as we see that passage which is read before services in the Magnificat, we see that she recognized the blessing that she had in having the opportunity to raise this boy. Now the next lady I'd like for us to think about is Tabitha. And as we look at Tabitha, we see a lady who is in a very different situation than Mary. She's a disciple. And now, this is Acts chapter 9, 36 through 39 is the primary place where you'll read about her. And that term disciple, when you and I are reading the Bible, we may just fly over it because, disciples, that's somebody who follows Jesus. What's interesting is this is the only time it's used for somebody besides, or specifically for somebody besides the apostles. And so she held a special place. I'm not talking about church office, like an official church office, but she was known far and wide as a Christian. As far as we know, she had never met Jesus. As far as we know, she had never met Peter, but she was well known. She lived in the city of Joppa. She was known as Dorcas or Tabitha. And the reason she was known was for the things that she did. Her works followed her. And so they went and they found Peter and they brought him to her. And it doesn't look like they were looking for him to try to raise her back from the death. It looks like they were trying to say, Peter, look at how much of a Christian this lady was. Look at how good she was. And how do you prove her goodness? How did they want to prove her goodness? They were able to show the clothing that she had made. They were able to show the things that she had given to the widows to provide for them and to help them and to encourage them. A lady who has passed on to her reward, but many of us here remember Eileen Sloan. I remember one time when I went by to see her when she was in her house, she presented me a quilt. And she said, "This is your quilt." And I was like, okay. And she said that she had made a quilt for every preacher and every associate preacher of the congregation going all the way back to the 1960s. And I remember bringing that quilt to her funeral and talking about how in many ways she was a Tabitha. There were tangible things which showed her faith. There were tangible things that she did where even after she was gone, people had these things to remember to show her faith which was there. Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13 says this: "Blessed are those people who die in the Lord, for their works shall follow them." For their works, if you look at the alternate reading, shall help them to be remembered forever. You ever think what will be left after we leave this earth? You know, we're not taking this physical body. This physical body will be buried. It'll be resurrected later. But what is it that people will remember us by? Hopefully they'll remember us by the good words, the encouraging words which we gave to other people. Many of us who have lost some of our loved ones to eternity, we remember the hug, the touch of those who have gone on before and what it made us to feel like. Maybe if you're around, you have some of your grandparents or great-grandparents things which they would have, whether it be tools, whether it be sewing machines, or whatever it may be. Maybe you recognize people from church because the Bible classes that they taught that you sat through. Because of the youth trips you went on and they went with you. Maybe because of the church events where you always saw those people there, and those people were the ones who always encouraged you, who always helped you in everything that you did. I remember when I was growing up and just starting out preaching, and it was bad. Many times I would get up there and it would not go anywhere according to my plan. I was always nervous. I was always stuttering. I was always stumbling. But there were always people who encouraged. Always people who helped. Always people who would say, "I appreciate what you did, and I know you can keep doing it." And from that, now I'm a preacher. And we need to be a church of Barnabases, of Tabithas, who encourage, who help, who leave a legacy behind, whether it be physical or whether it be spiritual. We need people like that in the church for the church to be what we've been called to be. Now going a few chapters later, Acts chapter 16. In Acts 16, we'll begin reading verses 11 through 15. And we see a lady named Lydia. And as we think about this Lydia, we see where Paul is, he has passed through Asia Minor. We're now headed to the city of Philippi, which is the first city which the gospel has reached as far as going into Europe. And we, as we study Western civilization, recognize how big of an event this is, that Christianity enters into Europe, because Europe will be a beacon of Christianity to the world for the next 19 centuries. As Paul is there, he arrives in Philippi, Greek city, not a synagogue anywhere to be found. So he knows the Jewish tradition. You go to the nearest body of water, which is a river, and usually at that area, Bible believers, God believers will be there praying. And so he goes down there and he sees Lydia and he sees many of the ladies. And he begins preaching the gospel to them. Now, Lydia was from Thyatira, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. That is over in Asia. That's across the sea there, the Aegean Sea, if I'm not mistaken. And so Lydia was a seller of purple. She was a wealthy woman, and she would be traveling back and forth across that sea and selling her wares. Well, she happened to be in Philippi the same time that Paul was there in Philippi. And we see, it's fascinating to me, in verse 11, she hears Paul, and notice, she opens her heart. The Spirit opens her heart as she hears these words. Now, there are some of the Calvinist persuasion who talk about how maybe this means that you and I don't have a choice whether we're going to obey. The Spirit decides who's going to obey, who's not. And we know that's not what's found in Scripture. So what is Luke referring to when he says she opens her heart? She hears the words of God, and she puts them in her heart and determines she's going to follow. Even if it's a huge change, she determines, I'm going to follow the church. The church is going to be important to me. And so hearing this gospel, she and her family, here's the influence that she has, she and her family are baptized. And as she sees the gospel and as she sees the importance of the gospel, excuse me, she tells Paul and Silas, you need to come to my house. I want you to stay here so you can be in Philippi long term, so that as you're here, you can continue preaching and help this church to grow and be what it needs to be. And so Paul and Silas stay at her house so that they can continue preaching. So she's opened up her heart, she's opened up her family, and now she's opened up her house. Well, as you continue reading through Acts 16, you see where a slave girl is, she has a demon within her. And you see where Paul heals her. You see where Paul, because of that, he and Silas are thrown into prison. And you see where God releases them from prison, and the jailer is baptized that night. As we look at all that, now skip down to Acts 16 and verse 40. Where does Paul go after he's out of prison? After all these things have happened? He knows a lady who's opened up her heart. He knows a lady who's opened up her house. Now, closely related to this, Philippians chapter 4, verses 15 through 16, you see where Paul is writing to the church in Philippi, and as he has gone on in his ministry, he's writing back to this church. He's now in the Roman prison, and he says, I want to tell you how much I appreciate the way you've supported me in my ministry and the way you've helped me when I've been in Thessalonica. Well, who is it that's helping? Who is it that's opening the way? Very likely it's this lady right here, Lydia. What we notice here is someone who, when they see the gospel, they open themselves up to it. First of all, they open up their heart. Every time the church doors are open, they're there. How many of us know our mothers and our grandmothers that were there every time? Every time there was anything happening at church, they were there, and it was important. Like we said at the beginning of the lesson, many times on Mother's Day we have visitors, and they're here because they know how important church is to their mamas and their grandmas. She opened up her heart. Next, we see that she opened up her family. She wanted her children to know the gospel. She wanted her spouse to know the gospel. She wanted all those who are around to grow closer to God. We see where she opened up the way. She did everything she could, whether it's monetary, whether it was encouragement. She did everything she could to promote the work of the church. And it's ladies like this who help the church be what God intended for it to be. Now, the last lady I want us to look at today, or last two ladies, as a matter of fact, Lois and Eunice. Lois and Eunice. So we look in 2 Timothy, we read about this mother and grandmother. As a matter of fact, Eunice is the only grandmother we see specifically pointed out to in the Bible. What's significant about them? Well, Paul is encouraging Timothy in his work in the church there at Ephesus. And as he's trying to encourage him, he says, I want you to recognize the faith which you had as you grew up. I want you to recognize the legacy that you have. Well, let's talk about Timothy's family for a second. We meet him, first of all, in Acts 16, right? And in Acts 16, as we go there, we see in the city of Lystra that Timothy's father is a Gentile. We're not told about his spiritual situation, but it appears that he was a pagan, that he never obeyed the gospel, that he really wasn't present, at least spiritually, in his family's life. And so Lois and Eunice filled that part of Timothy's life. And they made sure that as a child, he knew the scriptures. 2 Timothy 3 and verse 15. They made sure that as Timothy grew up, he knew what it meant to be a Jew. He knew what it meant to be around the synagogue. He knew the stories of Scripture. He knew how to live as God would want him to live. This mother and the grandmother, even in an imperfect family, passed their heritage on to Timothy and helped Timothy to grow and to be what he ought to be. And so as we look at that, we see in many ways the roles that mothers and grandmothers play in the family structure, in the family life. 1 Peter 3, looking there at verse 1 through 6, talks about wives who have husbands who aren't Christians yet. And he says in that family context, one of the best things you can do is show your Christianity by the way that you live, and by the way that you speak, your gentle and your quiet conduct. And recognize the great influence which is there. Now, from a Jewish perspective, we would look especially at Lois and say, well, she didn't marry a Jew. She is leaving the faith. She is not what she ought to be. And we look at that and say, I'm not sure. But as you look more closely, you see this woman who is strongly attached to God and is certain that not only her husband sees what it means to be a Christian, but her children see what it means to be a God-fearer, to be a disciple, to be a believer. It's so interesting to see the impact which religion has upon a family. And as you and I go back in our genealogies, if you will, many of y'all here have been members of the church for 3, 4, 5 generations, as far back as you can remember. And there's some people who are still coming to church with their great-grandparents. And through each generation, you see that love for God. Through each generation, you see that dedication to follow God. Through each generation, you see the passing on of the torch, the attachment that people have for the love of God. And so as we go to our last slide, I want us to recognize today, not just mothers and grandmothers, but women who help make the church what it is. There are those who are raising small children who sometimes wonder, is it even worth it to try to make it through a worship service? With all the different things which are going on, with all the distractions, it is. And as you hold those things close to your heart, as you see those first steps, as you see in the kids' classes where they're patting the Bibles, recognize that God is working through you to pass the faith to the next generation. Those who may be older, we look at you as the people who leave that legacy behind by the works that you do in the church, by the involvement in the way in which you go. There's many Lydias in the church who open themselves up to try to encourage the church and help the church be what it ought to be. And then there's always the Lois and the Eunice, the ones who are passing on the faith over and over and over, raising their children up to know the Scriptures and to truly be the people of God. God has put us in a wonderful place. God has blessed us in so many ways with many of the people who are here. And we appreciate God. We appreciate the church. And we appreciate Jesus so very much.